She didn't cry when she was born. She howled. The midwife flinched, her hands still slick with the blood of birth. The baby's scream had a strange edge to it, piercing, full-bodied, more like a war horn than a newborn's cry. Her mother, weak from labor, tried to laugh. "She has opinions already," she whispered. But the midwife didn't smile. She muttered a prayer beneath her breath and did not touch the child again. From that day the village watched her with a strange unease. She was given the name Adago, but few ever used it. Most called her that girl, or worse, the loud one. By the time she was 4, she was already speaking in full, complex sentences. By 6, she questioned everything. Why boys could run shirtless but girls had to cover. Why the priest's ox was always fat when everyone else's were lean. Why her mother knelt before men who spat as they passed. She was told to hush more times than she was ever told she was loved. Her mother did her best to soften her. "Adago," she would say, smoothing her daughter's thick curls with nervous hands, "some truths are too heavy for small mouths." But Adago only tilted her head, eyes burning with quiet defiance. "Then why are lies so light?" she would ask. And her mother would close her eyes and whisper, "Because they float, right to your death." The beatings started after the festival of drums. The village had gathered to honor the planting moon. The priest stood before the altar, wrapped in white, the golden chain around his neck glinting in the firelight. But Adago had seen that chain before, clutched in the palm of her friend Amaka, who'd cried for 3 days when her grandmother's necklace was stolen. Adago did not whisper. She stood and pointed. "That's not yours," she said, voice clear and strong. "You took it." There was a silence so complete it felt like time itself had stopped breathing. The priest stared at her and then slowly smiled. "The girl is possessed," he said softly. "Her tongue dances with devils." No one defended her. Not even her mother. She was dragged home, and the stepfather she never loved waited on the veranda with a belt folded like a snake in his hand. "You've shamed this family," he hissed. "You've shamed me." The first strike came with no warning. The second landed on her mouth. She bled for days. And still she did not apologize. But she grew quieter. Not because she believed them. Not because she accepted their lies. But because she began to understand the rules of the world. Truth must be wrapped in shadows if it hopes to survive. She stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, she began to write them in the dirt behind the house, where only the ants could read. "Why does mother flinch when stepfather comes near?" she wrote once. "Where does he go at night and why does he smell like meat?" Another day, "Why did the village let the widow die alone even after she screamed for days?" She didn't know her mother had seen the questions. Or that she had wept silently beside them, too afraid to wipe them away. The worst day came after the goat disappeared. It was a small thing, skinny and lame, the only livestock they owned. But it mattered. It gave milk. It kept them in favor with the elders. And one morning it was gone. Adago found it later in the woods, throat cut, its body still warm. The meat was gone. Only the blood remained. When her stepfather returned that evening with a satisfied smile and fresh red stains on his tunic, Adago said nothing. She only looked. Too long, too steady. "You think I don't see your eyes?" he growled, grabbing her by the collar. "You want to say something, don't you?" She didn't speak. But that only made him angrier. The belt returned. Her silence, he decided, was rebellion. That night, lying bruised and breathless on her straw mat, she thought of all the things she'd once said. And all the things they'd tried to beat out of her. And still the truth remained. It did not need to be spoken to exist. It was a stubborn, snarling thing. It lived behind her teeth. It beat in her chest. It wrote itself into her bones. The next morning she smiled at her reflection in a puddle. One of her teeth was loose. Another was missing. Her lip was swollen. But her eyes, those traitorous, truth-telling eyes, were brighter than ever. She didn't speak much anymore. But not because they'd won. She was learning something else, something deeper than words. That silence, when chosen, could be sharper than speech. That a still tongue was not always submission. Sometimes it was a weapon in disguise. They did not see the shift. They thought they'd tamed her. The villagers stopped watching her so closely. The priest smirked when she passed as if her silence proved him right. Her stepfather stopped bothering with the belt so much. Her mother, her poor mother, seemed relieved as if peace had finally entered their home. But Adago knew better. Her questions had not died. They had only gone underground. She began listening. Truly listening. To the gossip of market women. To the drunken mutterings of men outside the shrine. To the cracks in conversations, the tremble in voices, the too careful phrasing. And slowly, A map formed inside her. A network of half-truths and buried shames and rotten roots. She discovered that the chief's son fathered children he refused to claim. That the healer used herbs to silence girls, not just heal fevers. That the well had been poisoned once to drive out a family who refused to sell their land. And she never said a word. But her silence was not empty. Was a waiting thing. A gathering storm. A cup filling drop by drop with the weight of all they'd done. She no longer feared the beatings. Because she no longer feared pain. Her body had become a shell, yes, but inside it something fierce had taken root. She would not shout again. But they would listen. They just didn't know it yet. She learned to swallow words like bitter seeds, sharp at first but deadly only when they rooted. The first lesson came with a slap so hard her ears rang for 2 nights. It was for asking if the chief's eldest son, who limped and cried in private, had fallen from a tree or been thrown. The room had gone quiet. Her stepfather's eyes had narrowed. Then came the sound, the heat, the tilt of the floor as her cheek hit the wall. The second lesson came with salt. Not the kind sprinkled over food in joy, but heaps of it dumped into her porridge, her yam, even her water when no one else was looking. Her stepmother smiled sweetly as she set the bowl down. Eat fast, girl. Your chores are waiting. She had learned not to question. The salt dried her lips, cracked them open. She drank in secret from muddy basins and chewed raw leaves to dull the burn in her mouth. But the worst part wasn't the thirst, it was that every word she wanted to speak felt like it turned to salt too. They tied her tongue once. Not metaphorically. Literally. A small strip of leather, tight and soaked in bitter root, wound under her chin and behind her ears until her jaw ached. It's for your own good, the priestess said, her voice like cracked clay. A girl like you needs a quiet mouth if she wants to live long. She was 9 then. She cried all night but quietly. When the leather was removed, her mouth bled. Still she hadn't learned silence. Not really. Not yet. Later came the fire. A small coal pressed into her palm after she whispered to another girl that the midwife had lied, that the woman's baby hadn't died naturally. The lie had unraveled quickly, and when the mother wailed in the street, it was the girl's voice they blamed. It's your mouth, her stepfather growled. Always your cursed mouth. The coal hissed against her skin. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. But she bit down on her cheek so hard that blood ran down her chin and into her dress. Still they feared her. That's why they did it. Because no matter what they said, she saw. She saw the village for what it was, its honeyed rituals, its laughing lies, its prayers said over poisoned meals. She saw how quickly grown men forgot guilt and how fast women stitched sins into silks. She saw how the truth hung in the air like smoke, always there, always choking, and she couldn't stop herself from naming it. So they punished her. Publicly. Repeatedly. Each bruise was a warning to others. Don't listen. Don't believe her. Don't be her. When she once dared to ask why the priest refused to bury the beggar's son, a boy who died choking on his own cough, they pushed her face first into a shallow grave and left her there overnight. So you can understand silence, they said. The earth got into her ears, her nose, her throat. She woke with worms in her mouth and fingernails clawed to the quick. But her voice, still raw, still unwelcome, remained. She began to change after that. Not all at once. Slowly. Like wood drying beneath the sun, brittle, yes, but ready to burn. She learned to press her lips together until they bruised. To nod at lies and pretend not to notice. To carry water when her back screamed and scrub pots that had already been cleaned. But inside something was gathering. A kind of waiting. Her silence was no longer submission. It was strategy. She wasn't swallowing truth to forget it. She was storing it. And with every quiet day her silence grew heavier, sharper. Like a blade that hadn't yet been unsheathed. When children played by the stream she sat nearby listening. She heard things others didn't notice. Who stole whose goat. Who beat his wife behind closed doors. Who bribed the healer to say the wrong name in a birth record. She watched as lies bloomed like flowers, pretty on the outside and rotting beneath. And she began to count them, every injustice, every shameful secret. Not aloud. Just in her head. A private book of wrongs written without ink, stored in muscle and memory. One day she caught her own reflection in a bowl of water. Her lip was split. Her eye purple. But her gaze, steady, unblinking, scared even her. She no longer looked like a girl. She looked like something waiting to be unchained. It was around then that the villagers began to feel something different when she was near. Not fear, not exactly. But discomfort. A pressure. As if her silence forced them to hear the echoes of their own words more clearly. When she entered a room the air felt colder. When she walked past, people suddenly remembered things they had tried to forget. The woman who gave her a rotten yam wept the next day, claiming she heard voices all night saying, "You fed her filth. You fed her filth." She hadn't said a word. When her stepbrother accused her of cursing his crops, he developed boils on his tongue within a week. He claimed she had looked at him wrong. "She didn't even say anything," he shouted. But that was the point. She didn't have to. Her stepmother, who once delighted in watching her lick salt from her plate, now twitched every time she heard the girl's footsteps. The woman began burning herbs in the corners of the house and muttering prayers beneath her breath. "She's not natural," she hissed to the priestess. "The silence in her, it listens. It knows." They were right. Because her silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Of names. Of moments. Of wrongs etched deep into the marrow of her bones. She carried the weight of every lie she had been beaten for, every truth she had swallowed whole. She wore it like a second skin, invisible but always pressing tight. And then came the dreams. They started as whispers. Breaths on her neck. Words she didn't understand but felt. Sometimes it sounded like beasts grunting in the dark. Sometimes like wind crying through hollow bones. Once she woke to find her palm, the one they burned, glowing faintly in the dark, the shape of the scar pulsing like a heartbeat. She wasn't afraid. Because somewhere deep down she knew. Her silence was changing. It had once been the cage they built around her. But now it was the thing that would unmake the bars. The village had taught her well. Every bruise was a lesson. Every punishment a seed. And now she was full grown, a garden of scars blooming with vengeance. She walked differently now. Not proud. Not loud. But unbent. She no longer asked questions aloud. She no longer cried when they called her cursed. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. It hovered around her like smoke, shifting, shaping, watching. One day as she swept the earth outside the hut, she heard a child say, "That's the girl who doesn't speak." Another replied, "But my mother says her silence makes liars choke." She smiled. Just a little. Because the lesson had been learned. Her voice had once made her a target. But her silence? Her silence was becoming a weapon. They called him Lami's son, though his real name was Yuzoki. He had a quiet mouth and wide, watching eyes, and when he looked at her, it was not like the others did, with suspicion, with mockery, or worse, with hunger. He looked like someone trying to remember the name of a bird he once heard sing. The girl, who had not spoken in weeks by then, noticed. And for once she did not look away. The first time he touched her hand, it was only to pass her a slate during lesson hours. The local teacher barely watched, half drunk on palm wine and boredom. But he pressed the chalk into her palm in a way that felt like a question. When she glanced up, he smiled just barely and tapped his own chest twice with a fist. She didn't know what it meant. Still, her fingers curled around the chalk like it was something alive. That was how it began. 1 tap for danger. 2 for safe. 3 for meet me later. They built it out of nothing. Shared air, shared space, the hush between punishments. He learned her language. The slow blink when she wanted him to shut up, the crinkle above her brow when something nearby was about to break, the way her shoulder dropped slightly when she was tired but pretending not to be. She didn't have to say anything. He heard it all. They met in the grove just beyond the yam fields. It was the one place no one bothered going after sunset, not because of spirits, but because there was nothing worth stealing. She'd sit cross-legged in the dirt, and he would draw symbols into the soil with a twig, speaking them aloud slowly so she could match the shape to the sound. In return, she taught him how to read the wind by the tree's movements, how to spot a lie in the tightening of someone's jaw, how to stay invisible by becoming part of the silence. He never asked her to speak. Never once said, "Try," or "Just whisper," or "I won't tell." And that was why she trusted him. In a village where every adult seemed desperate to either unlock her mouth or seal it forever, Yuzoki simply let her be. But secrets were impossible to keep where everyone watched for sin like flies on meat. It happened during festival week. Her stepfather, red-eyed and loud, returned home earlier than expected and found her slipping out with a dried gourd under her arm. It was a signal piece, Yuzoki's. They had carved matching lines into it. Her stepfather ripped it from her grasp, cracked it underfoot, and dragged her by the neck of her wrapper all the way to the center of the courtyard, where her mother dared not intervene. Yuzoki tried to run to her. But they caught him at the edge of the compound, 3 men from the village who called themselves uncles when it suited them. They said he was leading her into witchcraft. That the silence between them was unnatural. That girls were meant to obey, not to listen. That boys should not learn to read a girl's silence. It made them soft. He was too soft. The boy who listened was beaten and sent away to his grandfather's home 3 rivers away. They said it was for his own good, that he needed to remember how to be a man. She never saw him again. As for her, that night they did not just beat her. They beat the blinking out of her. They slapped her until the whites of her eyes bled. They tied her to the post where the goats were once sacrificed and left her through the night. No food. No water. Just the wind and the red moon. And yet, in that silence, she did not cry. She held every tear like a pearl in her throat. She remembered how Yuzoki had once brushed dust off her shoulder like it was treasure. How he had tapped her palm when she was cold. How he had never tried to make her into someone else. She clung to those memories like rope. And when the dawn came and they untied her with mocking hands and sour breath, they expected her to collapse. But she stood upright. Her mouth closed. Her eyes unblinking. And not even the chief's wife, who prided herself on cruelty, could meet her gaze. She was alone again. But this time she was also not. The village thought they had won. She no longer raised her voice. She no longer questioned. No tears, no screams, no accusations. She walked through the village like a shadow now, eyes down, lips closed, hands hidden beneath threadbare cloth. When people passed her, they no longer bothered to jeer or point. They whispered instead, unsure if she still breathed like the rest of them. But she did. She breathed differently now, like the hush between lightning and thunder. And the village didn't know it yet, but that silence had teeth. The first to notice was old Nebuike, the blacksmith's brother. He was known for boasting loud lies in the square, claiming he'd caught a lion with his bare hands, that he'd once married a river spirit who begged for his touch. No one believed him, but they laughed anyway because his lies made boring days pass. One evening, after he joked that the girl's silence was because she had no soul, something shifted. He sat down for palm wine and began to wheeze. His tongue thickened like it was filled with mud. His lips went dry and no sound came from his throat. He clawed at his mouth, choking on something that wasn't there. It lasted hours. By morning he couldn't form words, only whimpers. The healer said it must be poison. The priest said it was punishment. But no one dared look at her. Then it was Madame Igioma, who had once shouted that the girl's womb should be sewn shut to stop her poisoned blood from cursing the village. She said this during evening prayer, standing proud beneath the shrine of the ancestors. Her voice was sharp as knives. But midway through her chants, her throat closed. Her lips moved but no sound came. Her mouth stretched in panic. Her daughter said she woke the next day with her jaw locked, unable to swallow. It took weeks before she could speak again, and even then her voice was brittle like dried leaves. Still, no one connected the dots aloud. They blamed the heat. Bad spirits. The fault of others. They looked everywhere except at the girl who now moved in silence so deep it made windows shudder when she passed. She never looked up. She never smiled. But sometimes, her eyes flicked to those who lied, and those eyes were no longer afraid. They were still, cold, watching. And something about being watched like that made people shift uncomfortably in their chairs, made their mouths falter mid-sentence. Children stopped mocking her. They would run past her with their heads low, unsure if they were being brave or stupid. One child who mimicked her limp and stuck out his tongue collapsed that night in fever, speaking gibberish in his sleep. His mother cried that a spirit had entered him. She sacrificed a goat to cleanse the compound. But when the child woke, he only stared at the girl's house and refused to speak for a full moon cycle. Afterward, he walked with a limp of his own, and never mocked anyone again. Even her stepfather, once bold and violent, began to avoid her. He no longer drank in the open. No longer shouted her name in anger. Once, she crossed him on the footpath and he veered away like he'd seen a scorpion. That night, the goats wouldn't enter the barn. His water turned sour. He lost all taste in his tongue for 3 days. When it returned, everything tasted like ashes. And so the girl walked alone. Always barefoot. Always quiet. But her silence was no longer passive. It was felt, like heat, like hunger, like dread. Wherever she stood, truth trembled. People began to speak more carefully. They double-checked their words, confessed their sins in private, avoided gossip, and wore white more often. Some even started giving her offerings. Little tokens, shells, fruits, cloth, left at the edge of her path like peace treaties. The priestess called a secret meeting, urging the elders to cleanse the land. But when she tried to utter the girl's name, her lips cracked and bled. She called it witchcraft. Said the silence was unnatural. Said it needed to be undone. Yet she never dared go near the girl. She only burned herbs at night and muttered prayers through gritted teeth. Still the silence remained. And through it all the girl never spoke. Not even once. But in her stillness, in the way the wind followed her and doors closed behind her without a touch, everyone began to understand, she had not been defeated. She had simply gone deeper. Beyond words. Beyond crying. Her silence was no longer a wound. It was a warning. And those who ignored it would find their lies turning to dust in their mouths. The silence that stared back was no longer her punishment. It was her power. And now the village listened. Not to her voice, but to her silence. The children used to throw pebbles at her door just to hear if she'd grown. Now they walked with heads down, circling the long way home. Her window, once the target of games and taunts, became a place no one dared look toward for too long. The wind shifted there in unnatural ways. Leaves never settled on her step, but whirled in dizzying patterns, like a ritual only the air could perform. It began slowly, this change. The baker, known for accusing her of stealing a roll years ago, was the first to speak of it, though not by name. His bread began baking strange. At first they thought it was just the heat. But soon even he admitted that the loaves carried shapes. Mouths gaping in silent screams, eyes half-lidded as if in mourning, teeth baked into the crust as if they had tried to speak and been swallowed by the dough. He tried using a different oven, different flour, even prayers over his ingredients. Nothing helped. He stopped selling to anyone who asked questions. The wind was no longer just wind. It wasn't just the baker. It was the cloth seller who once spread rumors about her mother's death, who now found that his bolts of linen came threaded with strands of hair that looked too much like hers. It was the butcher who'd laughed when she was punished in the square, who now heard heavy breathing in his home at night, only when he lied to his wife. A pause between gusts. A stillness too sharp. And then a slamming door or ashes in his mouth choking him mid-sentence. They didn't say her name, but they said, the girl. Said, her house. Some said, the cursed one, though others dared not speak even that. It wasn't just silence anymore, it was a silence that hunted. One woman, the priest's cousin, spoke too boldly during a funeral. She claimed the dead man had confessed lies to that girl before dying. She mocked the silence. That night she lost her voice mid-prayer, and not to a cold or cough. Her throat sealed up like the wind had knotted it shut from the inside. Her husband swore he saw dark mist leave her mouth and float through the window, heading in the direction of the silent house. Even animals acted strange. Birds stopped perching on her roof. Dogs passed her gate with their tails tucked, eyes averted. Cats stared, unmoving, at her window for hours, until someone dragged them away. The village knew fear, not the kind that made you scream but the kind that dried your tongue and made your thoughts feel like whispers you couldn't trust. They tried rituals. Salt at the corners of their homes. Chalked blessings on their doors. Candles that were supposed to protect from tongueless spirits. But none of it helped when the lies came. If a man lied to save face, soot would appear in his food. If a woman lied to shame her neighbor, her child would wake with bruises shaped like letters, crooked, curling across their backs like sentences no one could read. The elders began holding meetings. They said, perhaps it's not her. Perhaps it's what followed her silence. But none dared to speak to her. None dared to ask. At night, she still sat by her window, eyes half-lidded, face unreadable. Her hands rested in her lap like prayerless offerings. She never smiled. She never frowned. She just watched. Some swore they saw her lips move once, but nothing came out. Others claimed the wind that passed her window didn't touch her hair, only curled behind her as if bowing. One morning an elder came to her gate, trembling. He knelt and asked forgiveness, though he didn't say for what. She didn't answer. Didn't move. But the next day his wife, who had been mute for years, began humming a lullaby no one had heard before. And the wind for that night slept. They realized then that it wasn't revenge she kept in her silence. It was truth, and truth was a living thing now, wild and free. And it listened even when she didn't speak. Under the fading light of each day she walked. No one followed. No one dared. Her feet found the path instinctively, the one that led to the old ravine on the edge of the village, the place they all pretended didn't exist. It was overgrown with thorny brush and shadowed by ancient trees that leaned in as if listening. Long ago it had been where people buried animals and sometimes secrets. The stories were spoken in hushed tones. Of women who went missing and were never looked for, of children lost, to fevers no one saw, of confessions drowned in shallow streams before they reached the ears of gods. She went there anyway. Not out of curiosity, no, it was need. The silence inside her had grown too large, too restless. There was no room left to breathe. And yet, the moment she entered the ravine, it was as if the earth inhaled her. The ground was soft beneath her feet, the air thick with something unseen, and the wind seemed to hush itself the moment she stepped past the final tree. At first she thought it was her imagination, the whispers that clung to the breeze, curling around her ears like smoke. Then one night a voice spoke clearly. I was drowned for saying his name. A woman's voice, old, cracked, and soaked in sorrow. The girl turned sharply, heart thudding. But there was no one there. Just a pool of water at the ravine's base, still and deep despite no rain. The next night another voice. They said I fell. But I was pushed. A child's voice, no older than 6, came from beneath a pile of moss-covered rocks. On the third night, a whisper rose from the trunk of a fallen tree. I tried to confess before I died. No one let me. Each evening brought more voices. Not all at once, but enough to fill the air like a chorus of forgotten truths. The dead did not ask her to fix what had been broken. They did not seek vengeance. They simply wanted to be heard, and she, the girl who no longer spoke, became their listener. She never responded aloud. Her mouth remained sealed, her tongue like folded linen inside her lips. But her silence was not passive. She listened with her body, her breath, the angle of her shoulders. And the dead, sensing they were finally being witnessed, began teaching her. They showed her how to see what was unsaid. How to hear the tremor in a sentence. How to sit still until someone's lie rotted in their throat from guilt. They taught her the shapes of truths buried in laughter, in glances, in skipped steps and awkward pauses. The woman from the pool told her how to drown a person in their own secrets. The child showed her where liars usually looked when they remembered what they'd done. The man taught her how to stare long enough for someone's shame to rise to the surface, hot and visible. She didn't know how the learning entered her, only that it did. She would return from the ravine each night with hands empty and a power she couldn't name clinging to her skin like dew. Her step became quieter. Her gaze sharper. Her presence heavier. People noticed. Not all at once but gradually. The butcher's wife, who once spit at her feet, stumbled backwards just from seeing her walk past. The village priest, who'd once called her cursed, began stammering mid-sermon whenever she entered the back of the shrine. Children who had mocked her now stopped and stood still, eyes wide, uncertain if she was child or something else. One evening, her stepfather opened his mouth to accuse her of something she hadn't done. The accusation froze on his tongue. Not because she said a word, she didn't, but because her silence pressed against his chest like a weight. He forgot what he was going to say. Forgot why he was angry. He walked away shaking, and later that night, was heard whispering apologies to no one. The ravine had not just given her strength, it had returned her to the world different. Her mother watched her carefully now. Not with hatred, not quite, more like awe and fear. She stopped asking where the girl went at night. Stopped asking if she was eating. Just left food near the door and prayed it would be gone by morning. The girl ate when she wanted. Slept when she could. And always at dusk returned to her teachers. The dead did not rest. They stirred the soil beneath the ravine. They hummed with unfinished stories. And she, the silent one, became their vessel. Not their avenger, no. But a reminder. A keeper of memory. A warning etched in skin and stillness. The villagers began to say the air around her crackled now, like it was full of storms not yet spoken. Some said her eyes glowed faintly at night. Others said her shadow moved separately from her body, stretching longer than it should, curling around liars like a rope. No one could prove anything. But no one dared speak falsehood near her anymore. And when she passed, silent as ever, they lowered their gaze, not because they pitied her, but because they feared what might rise behind her if they didn't. The dead had taught her well. The village dressed itself in bright fabrics and noise. Drums were beaten. Meat roasted on open fires. Children with painted faces danced with streamers tied to their wrists. It was the festival of truths, a celebration meant to purify the village through songs, declarations, and speeches from the elders. Everyone was expected to come forward and speak their part. What they had done for the village that year, what oaths they swore to uphold, and what wrongs they would make right. It was meant to be a cleansing, a loud, bright event to keep the spirits of deceit and rot away from the land. She came in silence. She wore no ribbons. She brought no dish to share. She did not paint her face. She sat alone on a stone near the edge of the gathering circle, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes half lowered, staring at the dust. Children gave her a wide berth. Some adults glanced at her, then quickly looked away. She wasn't banned from the festival. No one had dared say it out loud, but her presence prickled. It made people forget their words and shift their feet. The first speaker was the village priest. He stood with his ceremonial staff and began the annual blessings. But on his third sentence his voice cracked. He coughed, tried again, and then his throat closed entirely. No words came. He grabbed at his collar, red-faced, then stumbled from the platform. The crowd murmured. The second was the village merchant, who began boasting about the grain he'd donated during the dry season. But his voice stuttered mid-sentence. He blinked, confused, and then began to repeat himself, slurring slightly. His hands trembled as he clutched the scroll. His speech unraveled like frayed thread, until he stood there, sweating, unable to say his own name. A third elder, one known for his honeyed lies and backdoor deals, took the stage next. He barely got through 2 sentences before he began to choke. Not on food, he had eaten nothing. His eyes bulged as if invisible hands were pressed to his throat. He coughed and gagged until he fell to his knees, finally spitting out a small stone, smooth and black, that no one could explain. Silence fell over the celebration like a dropped veil. Every eye turned to her. She had not moved. Had not flinched. Her face was unreadable, not cold, not cruel, simply still. As if none of this surprised her. As if she had known the exact weight of every lie before it was even spoken. A few people backed away from her without realizing they were doing it. The silence she carried didn't just follow her anymore. It hovered like a cloud, pushing against the walls of every mouth that tried to shape dishonesty. Whispers started. "She's cursed," someone hissed. "It's her silence, it's swallowing words." Another said, "She never forgets. That's what it is. She remembers what people lie about, and something makes them choke on it." Later, in the middle of the feast, the winds picked up suddenly, snatching plates and overturning cups. But only in the center of the gathering. Near her the wind stilled. Trees swayed far from her, but the ones above her remained motionless, as if even the branches feared to rustle in her presence. The villagers gathered in secret that night. They tried to talk about exiling her again, said the festival had been cursed by her very presence. But the next morning when they sent a group to confront her, none could step into her yard. The birds in the trees above her cottage stayed rooted there, silent and unmoving as if they'd been carved. A dog that followed the group whimpered and fled. The wind again ceased the moment they drew near. She stood on her porch as they approached. Said nothing. Did nothing. But her eyes flicked toward them just once, and each person who met her gaze lowered their own. The silence between them pressed down heavy, like 1,000 buried truths had all grown teeth. They left without speaking. After that, no one approached her again. Not with words. Not with threats. Some left offerings near her gate, flowers, coins, even apologies scribbled on torn cloth. Not because she demanded it. She never asked. But something inside them had changed. A guilt that had hardened into stone and then shattered under the weight of her quiet. She continued to sit by her window as she always had, her eyes lifted slightly toward the sky. And in the years that followed, whenever the Festival of Truths returned, no one dared to lie anymore. Not even in jest. They feared stuttering. Feared choking. Feared the wind might rise and choose them next. They arrived just before dusk, one by one, walking along the paths that twisted beyond the hills, skirts dusty and eyes set with a quiet sort of purpose. They did not travel in groups, nor did they announce themselves with knocking or names. They stood at the edge of her home, some with swollen lips, some with bandages where words had once been pulled from their throats like weeds. And when they saw her, the girl whose silence had become legend, they didn't ask questions. They simply waited until she nodded or moved aside, or opened her palm toward them like an invitation written in breath. The first girl came from the east, her voice taken by a father who punished every whisper. The second bore burns along her jaw, gifts from a brother who hated when she corrected him. The third had never been allowed to speak her mother's name. And on they came, girls with stories pressed into their skin like bruised parchment, stories they no longer needed to speak aloud to be believed. She did not speak to them. But she did not need to. She showed them how to speak with stillness, how to wield absence like a blade. In her presence, silence was not a void, it was a flame, and the guilty could not withstand its heat. The girls learned quickly. They watched her walk without flinching past those who had once accused her. They watched her sit in the market as vendors grew quiet under her gaze, truth trembling just beneath their lips. They watched her touch the soil and pull from it life, carrots fat with color, herbs sweet with strength, even as storms brewed just beyond her home but never over it. They did not call themselves anything. They did not hold councils or name roles. But each evening, when the sun began to sink behind the trees, they gathered in her garden. They sat on the ground, backs straight, eyes soft, breathing together as if they had all remembered something ancient. One girl would place her hand on another's shoulder, a gesture of recognition. Another would touch her chest and then nod, "I see you. I'm still here." It was a new language or maybe an older one, before words were twisted, before speaking became dangerous. Here a glance could mean defiance. A breath could mean consent. A shared look could scream louder than any voice ever could. They were not trying to be understood by the world. They were learning to understand each other. The old women of the village watched with suspicion. They called the girls cursed, witches, silent serpents nesting in the shadow of a godless girl. But even they could not explain the sudden growth of her crops, the way the wind stilled when she stood, or how the stray animals, goats, dogs, even hawks, came to rest near her porch without fear. No thief entered her yard. No illness touched her door. Her quiet had become sanctuary, and it drew the wounded to her like water finds the roots of trees. It was the liars who suffered most. The merchant who once whispered cruel stories about her to foreigners now stuttered through every transaction. The midwife who had once slapped her for not answering fast enough forgot the names of herbs and had to be guided by the silent girl's gestures. And slowly, one by one, the worst of them began to leave. The ones who had thrived on power through words, who fed on the weakness of those too soft to shout, they packed their carts and vanished into the hills. Not because they were banished, but because they could no longer bear the weight of truth pressing on their lungs. What remained behind was a village transformed. Words were fewer now but sharper, truer. No one shouted unless it was with joy. No one lied unless they wanted to feel the wind burn through their teeth. And children, those who had not yet learned fear, would sometimes sit outside the silent girl's home, drawing pictures in the dirt, mimicking her calm. Some even said they could hear voices in the quiet, not from her but from something older that spoke through the hush. She did not become their leader. She never asked to be followed. But when the girls looked at her, they did so the way one might look at a mirror made of stormlight, not to see themselves but to see what they could survive. And when they breathed together under moonlight, mouths closed and hearts open, the village no longer dared to name them cursed. They whispered their names like prayers, the girl who spoke with silence and the others who had learned to listen. The judge arrived in a black carriage with wheels that stirred no dust, though the summer was dry and the road cracked. His guards dismounted stiffly, their hands close to their swords, eyes sweeping the quiet village like a battlefield. He wore a robe of clean parchment white, the hem unsoiled despite the journey, and in his gloved hand he clutched a satchel heavy with sealed scrolls. The prince had sent him, he said, because rumors had outpaced the wind, of a girl who did not speak but caused others to tremble, whose silence had driven grown men into hiding and made liars' tongues seize in their mouths. The prince, curious or afraid, had ordered a reckoning. The villagers gathered reluctantly at the square, forming a half-ring behind the well. No one would meet the judge's eye. The air felt thinner, somehow tighter. She stood by the tree, not a step ahead, not a step back. Her dress was plain, her hair braided down her back, her hands at her sides. She did not blink as he approached. "Speak," the judge ordered, voice clipped. "You will answer questions in the name of the crown." She did not. He raised a scroll and broke its wax seal with a gold-handled knife. "These are the accounts of stolen land," he said, unrolling it. "Disputed inheritance. Crops that should have gone to elders, now claimed by merchants. Tell me, is this your doing?" She tilted her head, no more than a breath of motion, and the ink on the scroll bled. Not spilled, bled, as though the paper itself wept dark tears. Words twisted, ran into each other, corrupted by something unseen. The judge stepped back in disgust. Another scroll was opened. False marriage claims. A widow's son declared illegitimate. "Who whispered this filth into the ears of law?" he barked. The scroll cracked, a line of flame running down its center. Not fire, not heat, just light, pure and blue like the moon's rage. The villagers gasped. The judge's hands trembled, his tongue flickering behind his teeth like something caught. He turned to her, now pale. This is sorcery," he spat. "You will confess. You will speak." But as he raised his hand to point, his throat closed. His mouth opened wide but produced only a clicking sound, like a stone tapping against a hollow shell. He clutched at his neck, choking on nothing, then fell to his knees. She took one step forward. His lips turned blue. He crumpled entirely. For a moment, it seemed he might die right there on the ground. But then the pressure lifted. He gasped air into his lungs and crawled backward, whispering, "Untouched by sin. She is not to be judged. Do not provoke her." He scrambled to his feet, tossed the satchel of scrolls into the well without a word, and staggered back toward his carriage. His guards did not move until he was inside. Then they fled like dogs from thunder. That night, the Hall of Records caught fire. The flames came silently. No crackling, no smoke, only blue light spilling from the windows like ink from a torn sky. Villagers gathered again, but no one dared throw water. Inside, shelves fell, scrolls turned to ash, but not all. In the morning, when the light faded and the air cooled, the building stood blackened but not destroyed. They crept in one by one and found what remained. Every forged name, every bribed signature, every crooked deal had burned away. But the honest ones, the contracts written in truth, the accounts kept clean, glowed faintly blue, untouched by flame. Even the floor around them had not charred. From that day forward, no one questioned her again. Children stopped playing near the tree where she stood that morning. Men who had once raised their voices now nodded with caution. Women who had suffered quietly found their pain written suddenly on public walls, in handwriting no one recognized, signed only with a dot, and justice followed. The judge never returned. But others did, quietly, with questions not of accusation but of learning. They watched how she walked through the village and how dogs followed her, how goats slept near her door. They watched storms curve around her garden, rain falling everywhere else. They saw birds perch on her shoulder for a heartbeat, as if receiving instruction. The elders said she was dangerous. But one old midwife whispered a different word: necessary. It was only then the village truly understood. Her silence was not absence. It was a mirror. It was weight. It was judgment for all they pretended not to be. And now, none dared lie within earshot of her breath. They came first as curious wanderers, children too young to understand what silence once cost, but old enough to feel the weight of it. The house by the hill was not large, not grand, not gilded in gold or shrine wood. It was made of clay and old stone, patched with moss and softened by time. But around it nothing ever died. Flowers bloomed even in dry season. The wind sang gently even in storm months. And so the children came, without being called, without being turned away. They sat in circles around her garden, legs crossed, fingers still. At first, they whispered to one another, little questions blooming like wildflowers. Does she really never speak? Did she burn the records herself? Can she hear lies? The older ones hushed the younger. The rule was not written but understood. Here you waited. Here you listened. She never raised a finger, never clapped to command. But if a child lied, the wind would shift sharply and blow dust in their face. If one mocked another, the flames in the lantern would falter. And if one struck another, it only happened once. A loud crack split the air though no hand had moved. The boy who had struck cried for hours. Not from pain, but because the silence around her withdrew as though disappointed. It took days for it to welcome him back. They began to understand. Here, silence was not an absence, it was a presence. It filled the space between heartbeat and breath, between glance and gesture. In time, the children learned to speak without words. A tightened jaw said, "I'm not ready." A slow blink meant, "I believe you." A tilted chin, offered up, was the clearest apology. They created a new language out of quiet, old as stone, tender as rain. Some children came from far away, walking for days with nothing but a tale told by their grandmothers. Of the girl who was tied in rain and walked out dry. Of the one whose silence made a judge tremble. Some brought wounds they could not name, bruises hidden beneath sleeves, eyes always searching for escape. She never asked them what they had fled. She only opened the garden gate. And still the village whispered. Some said she had made a pact with a spirit. Others claimed she drank from the root of a cursed tree. But when a girl who had been missing for a week was found asleep beneath the tree outside the silent woman's house, unhurt, smiling, humming a tune no one else remembered, even the loudest gossips learned to bite their tongues. Over time, those who had mocked her fell quiet themselves. They began to greet others softly, to pause before shouting, to bow their heads when crossing her hill. They planted their crops in the pattern she once used in her own garden, for her soil never failed. And on nights when storms came, they gathered near her house without asking, standing silently until the clouds passed. No one dared speak on her hill. The children grew older. Some left for cities, for jobs, for lives where silence had no place. But they returned. With children of their own or with grief they could not utter. And still she received them. A hand on the shoulder. A glance to the sky. A place to sit and say nothing. And always healing. Not magic. Not miracles. Just space. Just a place where nothing had to be explained to be understood. She aged but slowly. No one knew how old she was. Her hair grayed like silver moonlight. Her eyes remained the same, sharp, soft, infinite. And when the stars shifted, when owls cried 3 times from the roof beams, Every villager knew to shutter their windows and close their mouths. Not in fear, in reverence. Because she was listening. Because the silence was alive and it remembered every truth never spoken, every kindness left undone. Children still sit outside her home to this day. Some come for the stories. Some come for the peace. Some come just to be near something they don't yet have a name for. They learn to listen, not just to each other but to the wind, to the breath of fire, to the ache in their bones that tells them when something is wrong. They learn that silence is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of meaning. And sometimes just before dawn, if you listen very closely, you can hear it, a long breath drawn in by the earth itself. As if the world is holding its tongue, waiting, watching, learning from the woman who never needed to speak to be heard.